All right, so I am digitally inking my syringe here. I have my smooth turned on my brush tool. I have it set at 100% hardness. It's just a basic, circle brush. It's not a textured brush or a softened brush in any way. It's at 9 pixels. I have it set for varied width instead of varied opacity if I use a stylus. But I am not using a stylus. I'm just using my trackpad. If I were using a stylus, it might be a little bit more comfortable, to go thick or thin. But you see, I want to have that one turned on, that one turned off, so that it stays really sharp. But with a trackpad, it's always going to give me the same thickness. And if I want to change it, I just have to alter it a little bit. So for the glass part of this syringe, I'm just going to go a little bit thinner. Just a couple pixels thinner. And because it's hard to do that angle, straight, I'm actually going to use this tool in the toolbar. And it's the rotate view tool, or sometimes called the tilt tool. And what you can do is you just can tilt your artwork with it. It doesn't actually change the rotation of your artwork physically. It just tilts your paper, just like you would if you were inking. And sometimes you need to tilt for a more convenient angle. And that way, spoke too soon, I can use my trackpad and hopefully, get those straights a little bit straighter. But I don't want them to be a vector. I don't want them to be perfectly straight. Even when I teach this in the lab and we digitally ink in Illustrator with vectors, I teach using a tool called the blob brush tool, which allows for this kind of digital inking within a vector program. Then I always have that eraser so I can kind of clean it up. And I like the little extra inks at the corners. There's an old saying in illustration, which you darken towards the V. And that's what happens when you overlap your inking. It kind of darkens in towards the corners. And that gives everything a little bit more presence and pop. Okay, with that same kind of thin line, the same angle, the same sort of deliberateness. You got to have confidence when you're inking. It's not the same as just sketching. When I teach drawing, I kind of call this an animator's line instead of a sketching line, because you're trying to be really clean and finished, right? And for the needle, I want that really straight, not bowed like that. So I might go for a smoothness that's really high. And this will basically be mechanical. All right. Now I'm going to take it back down a little bit. So if I'm doing straights, I might be in the 60s, but most of the time I'll be around 30. Now I wanted to point this part out of the syringe. I want part of it to be filled. And I want it to be filled with black ink. This is what's called full bleed inking. So what I can do is outline it, but then as part of my inking, this is a solid black shape. So sometimes we'll find this in the shadows of what we're inking. So I'm going to kind of flesh it out on its edges. And then it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to try to scribble in with this little brush, especially because it's starting to lag on me a little bit. Come on. all of this empty space, like kind of scribbling it in like this, hoping for it to fill. Instead, what I'm going to use is just the paint bucket tool. And contiguous is turned on. And I just drop it in. And if I do that and I uncheck anti-alias, you'll notice either way, I'm going to get little artifacts. Anti-alias is supposed to help with that. But that's just because a brush is not solidly filling every pixel. It's giving me grays at slight edges. So I can fill it, and then I can use my brush, or I can just actually fill it again. But then it might make my edges fully solid black, which is what's called bitmap. So bitmap on an image is when you have only white pixels and only black pixels. And it just doesn't look very smooth or good in a raster program. So this is what I do. You don't fill the whole thing, you fill the inside, and then you take your brush for full bleed, and then you just go over those areas where the artifact remains. So on the inside. And some digital artists choose not to ever ink full bleed because they could always just fill in the color with black during the coloring phase if black is the color they want. And I see some reason for that, but I wanted to use this syringe just to be able to show you that. Because part of inking is filling in blacks if you feel like those blacks will always be there. And it gives me the freedom to kind of push this shape into what I want it to be. Okay, so this is just this little syringe detail. Looks pretty good, looks pretty hand done. Looks pretty smooth, but not like it's clip art, right? Like my hand has given this some personality. Your flaws are part of your art. And so then if I turn off my sketch, I see what the digital inking is. And it takes zooming in quite a bit to start to see the pixels because I'm at 9 by 12 inches by 300 pixels per inch. So it's going to print very cleanly. Now I can just double click on the tilt tool and it will get back to its original orientation. So you just double click on it, go back to my brush. I can continue to use my shortcuts to zoom in and out. And now I'll continue with that small brush just to maybe a little bit thicker, maybe 9. So I'll work between 7 and 15 pixels, I think, for my digital ink brush on this image. I'm going to ink my little drop of vaccine there. This flower is anxious to get. Okay, so now you can do your line art all on one layer, or you can do what I'm doing and separate out different parts. Separating out different layers allows me to try the image with and without, with or without this vaccine shot, which I'm still a little on the fence for. I like it conceptually, but maybe it's a little visually busy. So what I've done is I've put it on the top and I'm going to lock it. And then behind it, I can just turn it off for now. I'm going to ink the other stuff. So go to my inking brush. I'm going to thicken it up a little bit. I'm going to ink this diamond. So you have to kind of have some tolerance for things looking a little off. And I'm kind of hovering over Command Z because sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, but I'm not looking for it to be absolutely perfect. So I like those three. This one was a tougher one to do. So what I'm going to do is try to redraw it. It's the same thing I would do if it was an editorial cartoon. And sometimes it helps to zoom in a little bit. I want it a little bit thicker there, a little bit smoother here, going down into the edge. And it's just a tough angle. I could use the tilt tool as well, but I can also use my eraser to work on both sides of the line. And again, I'm just using a trackpad. In some ways, it's easier with a stylus to control not just the direction and the wiggliness of the line, but of course its thickness as well. But that looks good. That's a good diamond. I have the vaccine on top. And so that's going to give me options for later. Okay, now I'm going to continue inking. And I'll do some of the fun stuff. Ideally, you find kind of a brush setting that just lets you feel confident and connected. Right? But then you also have your compositing skills. So at any time, I can just lasso what I drew. I can hit Control T in Photoshop. And I can stretch and alter. I can even warp. The difference is we are now manipulating pixels that we've created instead of other people's pixels, right? And the warping can sometimes give it a little bit more jagged of an edge, right? If you can kind of see. But at this resolution, it should all be okay. So you want to be forgiving to yourself. Yeah, that looks good. And notice I'm locking all the other layers because I don't want to have to worry about being on the right layer or not. So I like the idea of making this kind of eye cavity a heart shape, even though it's turned on its side. So inking that, sometimes you over ink, and then you can refine it with your eraser. The reason I recommend 100% hardness on your eraser and on your brush is so that when we color and we select within shapes, we don't have that much of an anti-alias kind of edge to worry about. It will clean pretty smoothly. I'm going to round this bottom out a little bit. Okay, now that I've set up multiple layers, it's a good time for me to save it. So I'm going to save it as